This is a legacy episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif podcast, originally released as part of the Lesbian Talk Show podcast group. Some references may be obsolete. The show looks at lesbian-relevant themes in history and literature, has interviews and discussions about current historical fiction with queer female characters, including fantastic versions of the past, and presents new original historical fiction for your enjoyment. This month's author guest is Janet Todd, and I'm going to start off with a little story about how I came to interview her. As regular listeners know, one of my shows every month includes listings of new or forthcoming historic novels featuring queer female characters. And one of the hardest parts of putting that list together is when books come up in my keyword searches, but the cover copy doesn't give me much of a clue as to whether and what the queer content is. So sometimes I crowdsource the question on Twitter and can usually get a confirmation one way or the other. So when I crowdsourced that question regarding Janet Todd's new book, Don't You Know There's a War On?, the person who popped in to answer was her publicist. And we messaged a bit about the book, and she offered me a review copy. And I was just on the verge of saying, oh, well, that's a lovely offer, but I'm not sure I can fit it into my reading schedule, when I went and Googled the author and immediately wrote back with, oh my God, you mean she's that Janet Todd, the historian? Any chance she'd be willing to come on my podcast? So now that I've thoroughly embarrassed her with my fangirling, Janet, welcome to Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast.
Thank you very much. I am never embarrassed by flattery.
So setting aside for the moment what I meant by that Janet Todd, let's talk about your new novel. So Don't You Know There's a War On is something of a psychological exploration of a mother-daughter relationship that seems, well, to put it delicately, not entirely functional. The framing story is set in the 1970s, but the bulk of the novel is the memoirs of the protagonist, Joan, who seems to feel that she's been cheated of the life she felt she was promised after the war. So what led you to pick this particular setting and theme to write about?
Well, it sort of came to me. I've been thinking about an incident when I was young, when I went past a house where the curtains were closed, and I was told that a mother and daughter lived there. The mother was possibly a widow, one didn't know, and the daughter had been educated and become a doctor, which was a very odd thing. I had never heard of such a thing in my time. But she'd come back and had a breakdown, it was called. And from then on, there they were in the house, and they didn't come out. And I was fascinated by the idea of a mother and daughter shut in claustrophobically, because after all, the mother-daughter tie is the elemental one, is such a big one, from whichever angle you look. But the idea that they would be shut in for life into it, I'm not sure they were. I just extrapolated from it. And I've sort of been fascinated by that ever since. And then, of course, being English, we have become obsessed about the war and a past that is no longer there. And the sort of sign of being intellectual and educated and properly liberal in England is that you've forgotten all that. And you've moved on to diversity and multiculturalism and so on. But it's been a huge change, and it's not clear, and I think Brexit made that unclear, whether everybody went along with these changes. And so I wanted to bring these two things together and write about an England that is still class-ridden, although the kind of person I write about from the aspirational lower middle class may perhaps now be almost extinct, or the female sort. But I wanted to bring that theme and think about England now a little with my idea of the mother and daughter together.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you used the word claustrophobic, and that was one that kept coming to me as I was reading it. And another thing that really struck me is that the household of this story, as you note, is a female household. And even in the earlier part of the history that comes out in the book, Joan's father was a very distant figure and he died fairly young. So she, to some extent, grew up in a very female-centered household as well. And Joan and her daughter Maud have relatives, but they're cut off from them in essential ways. It's a very female-centered type of isolation. And it made me think of how I have some female friends who are always going on about how, women can be so nasty to each other in a specifically female way. But I've also known books that centered around a similarly claustrophobic household with a mother and adult son, for example. The Glass Menagerie sort of comes to mind thinking about that. But how much of the interactions of your story do you think is a specifically female thing as opposed to the era and social situation in general?
I think it's female, but it goes in with the period because, after all, fathers in a time when mothers were definitely simply the housewives and were in the home all the time, and the man was to go out. Fathers were not that present, and then if you add the war on as well, then you take men out of the equation a good deal. But it does seem to me that at least when I was growing up, I'm not the generation of the mother. I'm much more the generation of the daughter. Even then, the father was very little present. The kind of work they did made that impossible, and the whole sort of economy of the house. And I think all this, in many ways, I think the period of the 40s and 50s were perhaps peculiar rather than being the later period being peculiar, in that after the war, women who had done so much work outside for the war effort were pushed back into the homes, and they were to be defined when men were, after all, somewhat few. They were to be defined as wife rather than mother. And so those households were, I think, dominated by a woman, but a woman quite often, the mother, who did not see herself primarily as mother. So I think it's a very specific moment I'm writing about, as I'm writing about a very specific moment when motherhood was of a certain type. At the same time, I think one can, of course, generalize, and it's certainly true that any parent-child relationship can become claustrophobic if the child is not allowed and encouraged to move off at a certain point.
Yeah, I know that at that same era in the US, there was to some extent an active propaganda movement to tell women, it's like, no, go back to the house, go back to being housewives, leave the jobs for the men. And there was this recognition that you had to take active social control to push women back into the houses and to make it look like, that was the norm. That was the normal thing you wanted to go back to.
And it was a sense, too, that for women of that generation, they had to hold on to a man who gave them their identity. And without such a person, then a certain amount of their identity was diminished. You have to remember, too, that there was a sense of surplus women. I mean, that was there, of course, in the, in the 19th century, when there was a great worry in England in particular about the numbers of surplus women and what could we do about it. And then again after, of course, the First World War, but too after the Second. And so the idea of the woman alone, the spinster, and even the widow had a certain kind of opprobrium, unless she was in a rather higher class than my character. I mean, people do write about it. Muriel Spark writes about it a little, and Anita Bruckner. But these are people slightly further up the social scale from Joan.
Mm-hmm. So to get a bit more into the sexuality aspects of the story, which are somewhat backgrounded, but the daughter, Maud, is the character who sort of flagged this book for my interest for the podcast. And in the opening of the story, Maud's sort of sometime girlfriend, Phyllis, who is now married to a man, gets a disturbing phone call from Maud and goes to rescue her. And then the rest of the story, as we see, plays out with Phyllis uncovering Joan's diaries. But one of the themes in the relationship between Joan and her daughter Maud is Joan's, jealousy of the opportunities that Maud had that her mother feels she isn't properly grateful for. And there's a hint that one of the things Joan is jealous about is the opportunity to choose to love a woman. Joan's own marriage was short, unhappy, and not entirely consensual. And there's sort of a hint that she might, under other circumstances, have been more interested in women than men. So was that something you intended to come out?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, but I'm not quite sure that's what I did intend. First of all, I think that Joan and that generation generally thought of education and chances as something that allowed one to move up into another class and then to have the choices. And I think she's not so much jealous in that respect of her daughter, but disappointed that what she had and what she herself had wanted, that education, had not delivered the social cachet that she had expected. On the other hand, certainly the friend, Phyllis, is straightforwardly a lesbian and is in love with Maud. But Maud, I think, from such a strange household, wants intimacy above everything. And is probably heterosexual, as she's not had much chance to work out what she is. And Joan, I think, has had such a terrible time with sexuality that is really more sensual than sexual, sort of perhaps autoerotic, not really narcissistic, but so damaged by circumstances that what she wants, or what one might think of as ordinary sexuality, is so repressed that I'm not sure one can say that of her. And when she comes to think of her pretty cousin, she doesn't so much want her, though she finds her fascinating and disturbing, as wants to be her. She wants to wear her dress. She wants to inhabit her body and in a way to become her and to feel sexuality through her rather than with her. So I think she's an interesting sort of character, and I hope she was interesting like that. At the same time, of course, as a child, she suffered the absolute ignorance that I think most English children did, unless they were from large families. I mean, the ignorance was absolutely extraordinary. And so when she had her sort of crush, as it was usually called when it was of a teenager, and which might well have moved into lesbian feelings, who knows, or adult ones rather, she couldn't talk of them. She didn't know what they were. She didn't understand. She simply had a sort of incoherent love for the other girl, a worry about her at the same time as she hated and started to dislike her own body. And so she does the self-harming, which is, again, so much a feature of childhood.
Yeah, that was something I found interesting because you have both of the central characters doing forms of self-harm. Joan cuts herself, and Maud, obviously has anorexia. And those are both behaviors that have come to be associated with women who feel that they have no control in their lives, and so they're trying to control something. I mean, there's more to it, obviously.
Yes, I think that's true. But also I'm trying to get into the mindset of the period. I mean, we are I don't know, we can be very proud of ourselves, can't we? We think at last we know everything and we're very clear in our views. And it's quite hard sometimes, I think, to go back and say, well, they thought something different.
Yes.
We think it's poor. We think it's inappropriate. We think it's very self-harming for them. But that is what they did think. And there can be an awful complacency from the present looking at the past. So I did want to try to find out, or to go back to an era in which girls were kept in quite extraordinary ignorance. I mean, even this is not autobiographical, I hasten to say quickly.
Thank goodness.
I went to a boarding school, and I had no idea that, and a lot of us were only children and had come from homes where these things were not discussed, though my parents were perfectly loving. There was huge worry over any girls becoming friendly at all. In dormitories, if there was any kind of friendship, we were immediately moved into another dormitory. We were not allowed to sit next to the same girl at lunch or dinner. And somebody was keeping sort of eagle eyes over all of us. We were given numbers so that the numbers would change and we would move around all the time. Now, none of us had the slightest idea, at least none of my friends, or I did, had the slightest idea why this was being done. But now, when I got hold of a friend from there, I left England very quickly, so I didn't keep up with a lot. But I've recently made contact with one of these friends from then, and she said, yes, it's fairly clear that the headmistress was a lesbian and was worried about it and was concerned that people should never think it. Whereas most, I imagine, of the parents of the farmers and whatnot around who sent their girls to this place would actually not have worried at all.
I want to talk about one of the prose aspects of your writing in this book, because you've depicted Joan as, I don't want to say, not particularly well educated, because she certainly had aspirations to be well educated, aspirations that were thwarted. But she comes across as having later absorbed a fairly anti intellectual take on life. But the prose of her journal within the story, it's colorful, it's poetic, it's full of metaphors and allusions, and it doesn't feel like the words of the woman that she is depicted as being.
Do you think not? I thought it was in that. I think that that period in which people were autodidacts precisely did have a disjunction between the way they could write, because they were reading all the time. They read and they read, as she did, and they swallowed the golden treasury. They learnt poems off by heart. They knew reams of stuff, just like that. But that didn't mean that they knew the appropriate cliches and quick remarks if they entered a class above them. And I do want to keep stressing this business of the lower middle class, which is where she comes from. A child of parents who are not educated, who can sort of carry it off in reasonable circles, but who know that they don't speak in quite the right accent. And the accent is so important in English circles, and still is awfully so, and who don't know how to pronounce the words that they can write. So I don't think it's unreasonable. She did read and read, and you can get an awful lot out of the golden treasury if you swallow that pretty whole.
Oh, okay. So that answers the question I had about how you had intended it to come across.
I just wanted it to be, I hope that people would find, I mean, she's awful. She is, there's in some ways a nightmare of the kind of person, an amalgam of people that I must have known as a child, because I was out of England for 20 years from 1960s to 80s. And I kept coming back and seeing the changes and seeing the way people had to move culturally. But that sort of person was still there. At the same time, I wanted her not to be sympathetic, but to be, I hoped, understandable, so that I don't want people to say, well, what, you don't know what it's like until you walk in her shoes. I want someone perhaps to understand why she goes on wearing shoes that so pinch her. What is it that keeps her in this position? Because after all, I mean, it's her temperament, which is already formed quite early, as well as circumstance, that keep her in this sort of prison house that she's made. But she's also somehow chosen it. And there's a kind of, I want to suggest, a kind of pride in being the outsider, in being the person who says no, the straggler, the refusenik, as it were, the person who will not go where the government is telling you where to go, will not change when you're told to change, will not get rid of the opinions that are now called prejudices, and so on. So I wanted to catch, in a sense, the vigour and almost vitality of such an awful person, I suppose.
So your academic research has been in earlier eras. You're a historian. You've worked on women writers of the 17th through 19th centuries. And you have written some previous novels that fall more in those eras that aligned with your academic study. I'm curious about why you chose to write this novel in a more modern setting, or whether that was just, you said you were inspired by a particular house and the inhabitants. Why a modern story?
Well, it isn't completely modern, of course. So I wanted to go back to think about the England that I missed in some ways, those 20 years out, because it is a strange place. And it's had to come to terms with so many changes in its position in the world. And I wanted to think about that. The periods in which I was basically researching the 17th and 18th century, England's on its way up. There's an ebullience and a hopefulness. The empire is growing, and it's considered to be a good thing at the time. It's exciting and it's adventurous. And I wanted to sort of pull away from that optimistic, rather outgoing period and concentrate on this strange post-war one, which is the world that is made me, I suppose. As I said, it's not my generation, but it's a world that I remember. I mean, I didn't have to do a lot of research for this because
Uh-huh.
the memories of rationing are mine, and the memories of the huge changes in class that came over people when they came back from the war, that I remember very well. I do have one peculiar memory too about rationing, about the value of food and how important it was. And that was because when we were in a rather poor rationing situation, when my parents and I left to go to Bermuda, where my father was posted at the end of the 40s, and we stopped off in America where we had actually no money, but we had a hotel. So we had this weird situation where for the first time I'd seen real food, lots of it in the shops, and we couldn't get it.
Oh.
And we remember standing outside these shops and talking about it, and my mother trying to explain what the chocolate would taste like, and so on. It was a very, very strange thing. And so I've always wanted to write a bit about rationing and the making do, again, of that generation. And then the sort of, and it's a female making do. The men are going out drinking and working in the way they usually do. It's women who have to keep on and who make a virtue of austerity and the sort of dinginess of the time. So to that extent, I think it's a female world. And it is, women did come together in a way probably then, in a way that could be heartening. It's just that I have chosen to write about somebody who couldn't take advantage of that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to have the stories that aren't the happy endings, the ones that talk about the normalness of awfulness sometimes.
Yes, I wonder too. I mean, I think that I've been to, as you've been talking and we've been discussing a bit about lesbian relations. I mean, I knew absolutely nothing about such things all the way up until probably very late teens. Really was not known, as we didn't know the sexual feelings that were coming to us, I think. So it's a very strange thing. So choices, I don't know what choices are in the way of sexuality and so on. But it's also, I think, partly the repression is to do with the kind of weird motherhood of the period. I don't know if this was in America too, but there was a way of bringing up children after the war that was dominated by a man called Truby King. You come across it?
Doesn't ring a bell.
Well, the idea was that a child should be brought up with totally controlled, and that the feeding should be only the child should not be picked up, should not be hugged, should not be rocked, should not in any way be fondled in the way that would make them into self-indulgent grown-ups who would be
that was a thing that was one strain of American child rearing. And then we had Dr. Benjamin Spock came in and wrote his book.
By the time I got children, it was Spock, and it was all change. Pick them up all the time, and so on. So you've got again a whole lot of people who would have been the result of this kind of weird upbringing, and who would have had a sort of strange relationship to the mother and to the mother's body. I don't know what damage it does. I haven't read about it, and I haven't sort of thought about it in any proper psychological way. But surely it must have had some of the effect that the wet nursing and putting children out had to do in the earlier periods.
So I understand that you've recently retired. You had a long and very distinguished career in academia. You've had positions at Glasgow University and Aberdeen University. You put in time as the president of Lucy Cavendish College at Cambridge. But now, as I understand it, you've retired and you're focusing a lot more on fiction. Are there any other novels that either are already out there or future projects you're working on that you'd like to tell us about?
I've always wanted to be a fiction writer, and I sort of fell into academics when I went to the States and couldn't get any other job, I have to say. But, I enjoyed it, and I think it's been a pleasant way of making a living. The idea of being paid to read books is very splendid. But I would like to have been a novelist from the start. And so I tinkered with them and wrote a few and put them in the drawer and thought about it. And only now I've really got going. But I did publish a spin-off of Jane Austen. It was a sort of rewrite of Lady Susan Plays the Game. Well, mine was called Lady Susan Plays the Game. Jane Austen's obviously was not. I wouldn't take on one of the great novels. I would feel really too inhibited. And now perhaps I wouldn't even do that. But at the time, I really enjoyed it. I absolutely adore Jane Austen, and it was such fun playing around with her. But my first published original novel was set in Venice, which I'd worked in from time to time over the last years, and which I therefore knew well. And it was a sort of Gothic novel, because I do love Gothic, dark novels, as you possibly gathered from the later one. And so and it was also allowed me to use the knowledge that I gained from writing endless footnotes for the editions of Jane Austen and Mary Wollstonecraft and Charlotte Smith and the women around the period. And I do love the Regency period, but not the Regency period so much of the sort of bonnets and pelisses, but the one that was rather cruel and dark and in many ways very unpleasant to the different classes.
Uh-huh.
But now I thought I'd like a few readers for this one. And if I can get any encouragement, I've already started another one, which I want to write. I did a sort of, it was a memoir really, though it was within a cancer diary. I had radiotherapy, and I wrote a diary of what I felt each day. And I found that it was primarily made up with literary quotations and thoughts. And it was my life, which came through it, but bits of my life that came to me. I hadn't written it for publication, but was persuaded very kindly later to publish it. But at the end of it, I've thought a lot of people like me who did have quite lonely childhoods and who lived in books. And for whom books were and writing and poetry were as real as anything else. In fact, more vivid often than real life. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to explore that, but in a group of people this time. I think I've probably done with the women alone. I know about women alone, so I'm sort of keen on it. But I would like now to think about women together, women who are attracted to each other in all sorts of different ways, erotically to some extent, but also just psychologically, intellectually, and are attracted often through works of literature, through poetry, through the sharing they have of quotations and thoughts from other writers in their head, so that past and present are sort of fused together.
Well, that sounds like something I would love to read, so I hope you do write it.
Thank you.
So if my listeners were interested in learning more about your work or even following you on social media, where could they find you online?
Well, my books are on Amazon and various other places. That would be nice if you would like to buy it. But I do occasionally do Twitter, and it's at Jan_Todd. And I also do have a Facebook page. I have to say, mainly in the last weeks, it's been with pretty flowers from... We're all locked down, as I imagine you are too. So we get out occasionally and take pictures of flowers to keep ourselves going. So those are possibilities. And I would love to hear from other people who are interested in the same topics as I am.
I think you have a website as well.
I do, yes. janettodd.co.uk.
I will include links to all of those in the show notes for people to follow up. And may I say, it has been an honor to have you on the show, Janet Todd.
Well, the honor is all mine, and thank you so much.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast. See the show notes for links to people and topics. Most shows will have a transcript linked as well. If you have a book announcement, a topic suggestion, or might like to appear on the show, please drop me an email. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate it and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and consider supporting our Patreon.